Okay, let's unpack this. Why do some robots or CGI characters, give us the creeps while others feel perfectly natural?
Yeah, it's a really common feeling, isn't it? That sort of
It
weirdness.
is, and it's a question people have debated for decades, really going back to this idea of the uncanny valley.
Right. The theory basically suggests that as something gets more and more human-like, our positive feelings towards it increase,
Hmm.
but only up to a point, just
Hmm.
before it becomes like perfectly human, indistinguishable.
That's where the dip happens.
Exactly. There's this dip the valley where it suddenly feels unsettling or strange or just plain eerie.
And we've actually got a stack of sources here, proper research papers digging into studies, experiments, trying to get to the bottom of what actually triggers that feeling.
Yeah, trying to pin it down. Is it just how something looks, its appearance?
Or is it maybe how it moves or expresses emotion? And what does the latest research really show when you try and test this stuff in a lab?
That's what we're digging into today. Our mission here is to walk you through these studies, look at what they measured, what they actually found.
And what it all means for how we perceive these near-human things.
Think of it as a shortcut, basically, to understanding why some things just feel off and what researchers are actually doing to figure it out.
So what stands out to you about this whole concept right from the get-go? Because, Moore's original idea, it wasn't based on actual experiments, was it?
No, not at all. And that's what's kind of fascinating. The concept started purely as a thought experiment back in 1970, that classic graph he drew.
Yeah.
It was based entirely on his subjective judgments, his intuition about how he felt.
So less science, more philosophical sketch, almost.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the term he used in Japanese, shinwakan, it's actually broader than just familiarity, which is how it often gets translated.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, it seems to cover things like affinity, empathy, comfort, even likableness. So
Yeah.
maybe that positive side of the graph isn't just about recognizing something. It's more about how much we actually connect with it. How comfortable we feel.
Okay, so building a connection, not just ticking a looks familiar box. That distinction feels important.
I think it really is. And, even though it started as this thought experiment, the uncanny valley idea has seriously caught on. Researchers in psychology, human-computer interaction, android design.
They're all taking it seriously now.
Absolutely. It's a major area of study now, with labs actively trying to test this valley hypothesis under controlled conditions.
Which brings us to a really fundamental question that comes up in these sources. Are humans and, say, very human-like robots actually perceived all that differently? Because some older theories suggested maybe not, right? If they're convincing enough.
Right, exactly. And this is where one of our sources, the Iwa and Sophia robot study, gives us a really key insight. They specifically compared how people perceived actual humans versus robots, including Sophia, who looks incredibly human-like.
And what did they find? Did it back up those older ideas?
No, quite the opposite. They found significant, clear differences in how the humans were perceived compared to all the robots they tested, Sophia included.
Huh. So it directly challenged those older theories, like the media equation or CASA.
Yeah, it really refuted them. Those theories basically predicted that people would react pretty similarly to media things as they would to real people, if the media things were realistic enough.
But just making Sophia look very human wasn't enough to bridge that gap in perception.
Apparently not. The big takeaway from this study is that we do perceive humans as distinctly different from these advanced robots. It suggests that seeing something as human-like isn't just about the outside shell, the visuals.
Okay.
It seems to involve something deeper, what the authors call the internal qualities of the robot.
Internal qualities. That sounds tricky to pin down.
Definitely. Which makes empirically testing the uncanny valley effect itself a real challenge. Our sources really highlight some of the methodological headaches.
Like what sort of things?
Well, one really big one is this issue of circularity, the circularity problem.
Meaning?
Meaning, if you're trying to figure out what makes something uncanny, but you start by picking stimuli, like robot faces, that you already think are uncanny.
You might just be confirming your own bias. You're basically selecting for the creep factor before you even start measuring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do researchers get around that?
Good question. What do they do?
Well, they try different approaches to select or create the things people rate more objectively. So instead of just grabbing examples they think fit, they might create carefully controlled sets.
Like morphing images.
Yeah, like morphing images along a scale, say from animal to human or robot to human, in measured steps.
Hmm.
Or they might use huge databases of existing robot faces or characters and get people to rate them first, then look for patterns in the ratings afterwards.
And they use standardized rating scales to try and quantify these feelings, right? Things like human likeness, strangeness, eeriness, I think based on work by McDorman.
That's right, those scales are widely used. And when you look at the results from studies that do use these methods, rating these near-human faces, well, that classic single valley graph starts to look a bit too simple.
How so? What did they find?
Well, one study mentioned in our sources found that the faces people rated as most eerie weren't necessarily the ones rated as almost perfectly human.
Wait, really? So the peak of the creepiness wasn't right at that just before human point?
Not always, according to their data. Sometimes the faces rated highest on eeriness were actually ones people saw as not human, or maybe only moderately human-looking.
Okay.
And another analysis looked at both ratings and the free text descriptions people wrote about the faces. They found clusters, like faces with low human likeness but high strangeness, and faces with medium human likeness and medium strangeness. Those were the ones people used the most negative emotional words to describe.
So the feeling of uncanniness, the negative emotion, was strongly linked to those ratings of strangeness or eeriness, regardless of the exact level of human likeness.
Exactly. And eeriness ratings positively correlated with people actually using words synonymous with uncanny in their descriptions. It suggests that feeling is a distinct emotional response.
That makes sense. It's not just pattern recognition. It's a gut feeling, an emotion.
Right. And then there's Tinwell's work from 2009, which is also referenced. This really complicates the simple single valley picture. They plotted human likeness against familiarity for different groups of characters. And they didn't find just one valley. If you look at figure 3 in the source material, you can actually see 3 distinct valleys for different kinds of characters.
3 valleys. Wow. Okay, so the uncanny valley isn't just one specific point you hit on a straight line towards looking human.
It really seems not. It's more like maybe different kinds of offness or inconsistency can trigger that eerie feeling at different points or in different ways.
Okay, so if it's not just hitting one specific spot on the human likeness scale, researchers started thinking, maybe the weirdness comes from how our brains are trying to process these faces.
Exactly. We normally process faces holistically, right? As a whole configuration, not just piece by piece.
Yeah, which is why the face inversion effect happens. It's much harder and slower to recognize faces when they're upside down, supposedly because it messes up that holistic processing.
Right. So the hypothesis became, maybe these eerie near-human faces feel weird because our brain can't process them holistically like normal faces. Maybe we're forced into analyzing them feature by feature.
Perhaps focusing on weird individual details, like the eyes or something.
That was the idea they tested in one study we looked at. They used those morphed faces we mentioned, blending animals, dolls, robots, statues with human faces in stages from 0% human up to 100% human. You can see examples of those morphs.
And they showed these morphed faces to people both upright and upside down and timed how long it took them to recognize them.
Yep. The thinking was, if eerie faces force analytical processing, then flipping them upside down shouldn't slow recognition down as much as it does for normal human faces, where inversion really disrupts the usual holistic process.
Okay, makes sense. And what did they actually find?
Well, accuracy in recognizing the faces was pretty high across the board. But the really key finding was about the response time. It was slower for all the inverted faces compared to the upright ones. And that was true regardless of the face type. Didn't matter if it was fully human, fully non-human, or any of the morphed stages in between.
So flipping any of them upside down made them harder and slower to recognize quickly, not just the human ones.
Exactly. So what this suggests is that the creepy feeling probably isn't mainly because near-human faces uniquely break our brain's basic face processing system in that specific way inversion does.
So it's not necessarily a fundamentally different way of processing.
It might not be. The difficulty could be simpler. Maybe it's just harder work for our brains to extract the information needed for recognition when the features themselves are distorted or inverted or halfway through morphing. Though, the literature does consistently emphasize how important eyes are in face processing, so specific features could still be key to what feels off.
Okay, so if it's maybe not how our brain processes them fundamentally, perhaps it's about the input itself being weird. Like, what if the problem isn't just looking almost human, but that the face is sending mixed signals?
Now you're getting to another major idea from the sources. Conflicting cues,
Conflicting cues.
like a mismatch between different parts of the face,
Yep.
or maybe a mismatch between the facial expression and, say, the tone of voice, though the studies we looked at focused on facial inconsistencies.
Right. The hypothesis being that these inconsistencies, these conflicting signals, could be a big source of that uncanny feeling.
Precisely. And there's a really interesting study in our sources that tested this directly by creating blended faces with mismatched emotional expressions.
How did they do that?
They took photos of the same person showing different emotions, happy, sad, fearful, angry, and digitally blended parts of them. So you might get a face that's mostly happy, but it has fearful eyes, or a sad mouth with happy eyes. Figures 36 and 45 give you a visual idea of these blends.
Ooh. Yeah, that sounds inherently unsettling. Creates a conflict you have to resolve.
It really does seem to. So participants rated the eeriness of these blended faces and also the original unblended faces, and they saw them both upright and inverted.
And I bet the finding here was pretty straightforward.
Very clear cut.
Yeah.
The mismatched faces were rated as significantly, noticeably eerier than the matched, consistent faces. That inconsistency really cranked up the creepiness factor.
Were there specific mismatches that were particularly bad, like the eeriest combinations?
Yes, happy faces blended with fearful or angry eyes. Those combinations were rated particularly high on the eeriness scale.
Huh. Happy with fearful or angry eyes.
Yeah, and this ties into psychological ideas about reading trustworthiness, right?
Yeah.
If someone's smiling with their mouth but their eyes look scared or mad, that conflict feels wrong, maybe untrustworthy, unsettling.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense.
Another interesting one was the happy face blended with sad eyes. That combination was rated highest for faces where people just said they cannot decide what emotion was being shown. Suggests a real cognitive struggle to categorize it.
So it's not just any mismatch, but specific conflicts, especially where there's a clash between positive overall signals and negative ones, particularly in the eyes.
It seems so. The eyes really appear critical here, which fits with general face perception research. They're key for reading emotion and seems central to triggering this uncanny effect when they conflict with the rest of the face.
What about the inversion part in that study? Did flipping the mismatched faces upside down make them less eerie or more?
Interestingly, inversion made both the matched and the mismatched faces seem eerier overall. You can see that in Figure 53 and Table 280 in the sources. Flipping them just added a general layer of weirdness.
But it didn't fundamentally change the difference between the creepy mismatched ones and the normal ones.
Exactly. The pattern of difference between upright and inverted was similar for both groups. Inversion made everything harder to process and slightly eerier, but it didn't selectively fix or drastically worsen the uncanny blends compared to the others.
Okay, so let's try and connect the dots here. We've got the Sophia study saying humans are perceived differently from robots, even realistic ones. We've got the challenges in just testing the valley shape with findings suggesting it's not one simple dip. We have the face processing study suggesting it's maybe not a unique breakdown in how we process, but maybe what we're processing. And now there's strong evidence for emotional mismatches causing eeriness. What's the big picture synthesis here? What really makes something uncanny?
Well, putting it all together, it really looks like the uncanny valley effect isn't just triggered by hitting some specific percentage point of visual human likeness.
Right. It's not just about looking, say, 95% human and suddenly falling off a cliff.
No, it seems much more nuanced. Conflicting cues seem incredibly important. That mismatch in emotional expression, especially a positive face with negative eyes, seems like a really strong trigger for eeriness.
Okay.
And remember the Sophia finding. That suggested internal qualities matter that perceive distinctness from humans. It implies consistency in behavior and expression is probably crucial for avoiding the valley. It's not just about looking human, but feeling coherent, believable.
Yeah, and maybe even excessive mimicry could backfire, feel wrong somehow. It's about feeling right, not just close.
Exactly. It seems more about our brains detecting subtle inconsistencies, things that feel off, maybe untrustworthy, rather than just placing something on a simple linear scale of how human it looks.
And specific features, especially the eyes, keep coming up as really important.
Yes. Eyes are central to face processing, emotion reading, and they seem to contribute significantly to the UVE, which fits with the mismatch findings and other studies on things like enlarged eyes causing eeriness. And those findings of multiple potential valleys, like in Tunwell's graph, that also fits this idea about thinking about different kinds of perceptual conflict or wrongness might create different dips in our comfort level.
So the valley isn't one single place, maybe. It's more like the feeling we get when we process something that looks kind of human. But there are conflicting signals, unsettling cues, maybe things that ping our untrustworthy detector. Those moments where our brain struggles to categorize it cleanly or senses something subtly wrong.
That really seems to be the key insight emerging from this research. That feeling of eeriness might be less about simply being almost human and more about hitting those specific points of conflicting signals. Like you said, the smile that doesn't reach the eyes or that disturbing blend of expressions our brain just can't easily make sense of.
So the research points strongly towards consistency, the critical role of the eyes, maybe perceived trustworthiness, these internal qualities that go beyond just how good the graphics are.
Exactly.
So what does this mean for the future then? AI, robotics, they're getting more integrated into our lives. Visual media is getting hyper-realistic. If eeriness is triggered by these subtle conflicting cues, what happens when machines get incredibly good at looking human, but maybe they fail on some subtle behavioral signal or emotional consistency?
That's the big question, isn't it? Does the potential for these unnerving, uncanny encounters actually increase as tech gets better visually, but maybe still struggles with those subtle behavioral layers? Or will this kind of understanding help designers actually navigate around these pitfalls? Can we design interactions that feel more natural, more trustworthy by focusing on consistency?
It really makes you wonder, as technology continues to evolve, what unexpected or subtle cues that we haven't even thought of yet might trigger that uncanny feeling in the machines we interact with next.